The morning sunlight filtered through the large bay windows of the bakery, casting a golden glow over the rustic interior. The bakery was a small but beloved establishment nestled in the heart of a quiet town. Its charm was undeniable, from the hand-painted sign above the door to the worn wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The shelves were filled with loaves of freshly baked bread, their crusts golden and perfect, while the air carried the irresistible aroma of cinnamon rolls and buttery croissants. Behind the counter, Juliet moved with practiced ease, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid that framed her heart-shaped face. Her cheeks were dusted with flour, and her apron bore the marks of a busy morning, smudges of dough, a streak of chocolate, and a faint hint of raspberry jam. The bakery was more than her workplace, it was her sanctuary. Every morning, she arrived before dawn, ready to knead dough and prepare pastries, finding solace in the routine. "Morning, Juliet," called out Mrs. Danvers, a cheerful older woman who came in every day like clockwork. She was the town's unofficial news anchor, always ready with a tidbit of gossip. "Morning, Mrs. Danvers," Juliet replied, flashing her a warm smile. "Your usual coffee and a croissant?" "You know me too well," Mrs. Danvers said, chuckling. "You're the brightest part of my mornings, you know." Juliet handed over the order with a small laugh. "You flatter me, Mrs. Danvers." As the older woman left, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of another customer. Juliet looked up to see a man entering, and her smile faltered slightly. He wasn't a local, she would have remembered him. He had an air about him, something that made him stand out from the usual bakery patrons. His tailored navy coat and dark, wavy hair hinted at sophistication, but there was a quiet intensity in his demeanor that piqued her curiosity. The man glanced around, taking in the cozy ambience with a faintly bemused expression. His gaze settled on Juliet, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. "Good morning," Juliet greeted, her voice as friendly as ever. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee." "Black," he replied, his tone polite but distant. He stepped closer to the counter, and Juliet noticed his eyes flickering to her wrist. She moved to prepare his order, but when she turned back, she caught him staring. Following his gaze, she realized he was looking at her bracelet. It was a simple piece of jewelry, a delicate silver chain with a star-shaped charm, but it had been with her for as long as she could remember. "Here you go," Juliet said, handing him the coffee. "That'll be $3. The man seemed to snap out of his thoughts. "Thank you," he said, reaching for his wallet. But as he handed over the money, his fingers trembled slightly. Juliet frowned. "Are you okay?" He offered a tight-lipped smile. "I'm fine. It's just that bracelet." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Where did you get it?" Juliet glanced down at her wrist, her curiosity piqued by his question. "This? I've had it forever. It's nothing fancy, but it means a lot to me." The man's brow furrowed, and he looked as though he wanted to say more, but instead, he nodded. "I see. Well, thank you for the coffee." As he turned to leave, Juliet watched him go, puzzled by the strange interaction. He walked briskly down the street, his shoulders slightly hunched, clutching the coffee cup like a lifeline. Shaking her head, she dismissed the encounter as one of the many oddities of dealing with strangers. Outside, Sebastian's mind was racing. That bracelet, it was impossible to mistake. It was identical to the one his sister had worn on the last day he saw her. The image was burned into his memory, his sister smiling warmly, the silver bracelet glinting in the sunlight as she waved goodbye. After her disappearance, he had searched everywhere for her, desperate for answers, but the trail had gone cold. He stared into his coffee cup, his hands trembling. Could this young woman really be connected to his sister? The thought seemed absurd, yet the bracelet was too distinctive to be a coincidence. As he walked back to his car, parked on the edge of town, his mind churned with questions. Who was Juliet? And how had she come to possess something so precious to his family? Meanwhile, back in the bakery, Juliet tried to push the encounter from her mind. The day moved on, bringing a steady stream of customers and the familiar rhythm of her work. Yet, every now and then, her thoughts drifted back to the mysterious man. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken sorrow, that lingered in her mind. Later that afternoon, as she closed up the bakery, she found herself fiddling with the bracelet. It had been with her for as long as she could remember, a small comfort in an otherwise uncertain life. Found as an infant, abandoned at a church doorstep, the bracelet was the only clue to her origins. She had often wondered about the family she never knew, but the questions always seemed too daunting to pursue. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm amber glow, Juliet stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, she thought, were answers she might never find. Little did she know, Sebastian was thinking the same thing. The art gallery stood on a quiet corner of the city, its large glass windows revealing glimpses of colorful paintings and sculptures within. Inside, Sebastian paced the length of the room, his mind far from the current exhibit. The clean white walls and soft lighting of his gallery usually provided a sense of calm, but today, they only amplified his restlessness. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl at the bakery. That bracelet, it couldn't be a coincidence. The star charm was unmistakable, etched with the same tiny engraving he had noticed so many years ago. He hadn't thought about it in a long time, but seeing it now brought back a flood of memories. He stopped in front of a large abstract painting, his eyes scanning the swirls of color but not truly seeing them. Celeste's face was all he could picture, her bright smile, her laughter, and the bracelet that had once dangled from her wrist. The memory was bittersweet. Celeste had been his anchor in a family that often felt cold and unyielding. Growing up in the Hall household was not for the faint of heart. Their mother, Eleanor, was a force of nature, poised, ruthless, and determined to mold her children into perfect heirs for the family's real estate empire. While Jason had embraced the role of the dutiful son, Sebastian had rebelled. He had always been drawn to the world of art, finding solace in creativity, but his mother had never understood. "You're wasting your potential," she had told him countless times. "You could be so much more if you'd only focus on what's important." For Eleanor, important had always meant the family business. Sebastian's passion for art was seen as a frivolous distraction, one that drove an even deeper wedge between him and his mother. But Celeste had been different. She had understood him in a way no one else in the family did. While Jason and Eleanor judged him, Celeste supported him, often sneaking into his room to admire his sketches or help him plan his next gallery exhibit. "She's our mother, Seb," Celeste had once said, leaning against his bedroom door. "She loves us in her own way. But you can't live your life for her." He had clung to those words, even after she disappeared. Her sudden absence had left a void in the family that no one wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor had thrown herself into the business, while Jason had taken on the mantle of the heir with even more fervor. And Sebastian, he had left. He spent years traveling, seeking inspiration for his art and trying to escape the shadow of his family's expectations. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't outrun the grief or the questions that lingered. What had happened to Celeste? Why had she vanished without a trace? Now, for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. The girl at the bakery, Juliet, might be the key to finding answers. He couldn't ignore the possibility, no matter how improbable it seemed. Sebastian's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the gallery door opening. A woman entered, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She was a client, one of the many socialites who frequented his gallery in search of statement pieces for their mansions. Normally, he would have engaged her in polite conversation, guiding her through the collection. But today, his mind was elsewhere. After a brief exchange, he left his assistant to handle the client and retreated to his office. Pulling out his phone, he hesitated before dialing Jason's number. It had been months since they last spoke, and their conversations were rarely cordial. But this was too important to let their differences stand in the way. The phone rang several times before Jason answered. "Sebastian," Jason said, his tone clipped. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the tension. "It's about Celeste." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Not this again. We've been over this, Sebastian. She's gone. You need to move on." "I can't," Sebastian replied. "Not when there's a chance she might have had a child." Jason's tone hardened. "What are you talking about?" Sebastian explained what he had seen at the bakery, the bracelet, the girl, and the uncanny sense of familiarity. Jason listened in silence, but when Sebastian finished, his skepticism was palpable. "You think some random girl in a bakery is Celeste's daughter because she's wearing a bracelet? Do you have any idea how absurd that sounds?" "It's not absurd," Sebastian shot back. "You didn't see her, Jason. There's something about her, something I can't ignore." Jason exhaled sharply. "Stop daydreaming and wasting my time. I have a business to run, and I don't have time for your wild theories." "Jason." The line went dead. Sebastian stared at his phone, frustration bubbling to the surface. Jason had always been dismissive of his instincts, but this time, Sebastian was determined to prove him wrong. Back at the family estate, Jason set his phone down, his jaw tight. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the photograph on his desk, a picture of him, Sebastian, and Celeste as children. Their smiles were frozen in time, a stark contrast to the fractured relationships that had followed. He was sure his brother would not pursue this further, after he rebutted him so strongly. He turned the frame face down and returned to his work, pushing the conversation with Sebastian from his mind. But deep down, unease gnawed at him. Sebastian, meanwhile, made up his mind. He would return to the bakery. He needed to speak to Juliet again, to find out more about her story. The possibility that she was connected to Celeste was too important to ignore. The next morning, he set off for the small town, the memory of the bracelet burning in his mind. As the bakery came into view, he felt a surge of determination. Whatever the truth was, he was ready to uncover it. The bakery was already buzzing with activity when Sebastian arrived the next morning. The bell above the door jingled, and the scent of warm bread and cinnamon greeted him as he stepped inside. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of Juliet behind the counter. Her movements were quick and precise as she filled a tray with freshly baked muffins, her auburn braid swinging as she worked. She looked up and spotted him, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "Back for more coffee?" she asked with a polite smile. Sebastian approached the counter, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Yes, but I was also hoping to talk to you again. About your bracelet." Juliet's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. "You're really interested in this bracelet, aren't you?" Sebastian hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's important to me. Can we sit down for a moment? I promise I won't take up too much of your time." Juliet glanced at the line forming behind him and sighed. "I'm swamped right now, but I'll be free in about 20 minutes. If you can wait, we can talk then." Sebastian nodded. "I'll wait." He found a table in the corner, his mind racing as he watched Juliet interact with customers. She had a warmth about her, an ease that drew people in. The more he observed her, the more convinced he became that she was connected to Celeste. When the morning rush finally subsided, Juliet approached his table with 2 cups of coffee in hand. She slid into the seat across from him, placing one of the cups in front of him. "All right," she said, leaning back in her chair. "What's the deal with this bracelet?" Sebastian took a deep breath, pulling the faded photograph from his pocket. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "This is my sister, Celeste," he began. "The baby in her arms is wearing a bracelet identical to yours. I think that baby might be you." Juliet stared at the photograph, her brow furrowing. The image was old and slightly faded, but the bracelet was clearly visible on the baby's wrist. She touched her own bracelet reflexively, her mind racing. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You think I'm related to your sister?" "It's possible," Sebastian said. "Can you tell me where you got the bracelet?" Juliet shook her head. "I've had it for as long as I can remember. I was abandoned as a baby, left at a church in my hometown. This bracelet was the only thing left with me." Sebastian's heart sank at her words, but at the same time, a flicker of hope ignited within him. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think we need to find out for sure. Would you consider taking a DNA test?" Juliet's gaze snapped up to meet his. Her initial reaction was one of disbelief, but as she studied his face, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't trying to manipulate her or make a spectacle of her situation. He genuinely believed what he was saying. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "This is a lot to process." "I understand," Sebastian said gently. "Take your time. But please think about it. If you are connected to my sister, it could answer a lot of questions, for both of us." Juliet nodded slowly, her fingers still brushing the star-shaped charm on her bracelet. She had spent her entire life wondering about her origins, but the thought of finally having answers was both thrilling and terrifying. After a long pause, she looked up at him. "All right. I'll do it." Relief flooded Sebastian's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." They agreed to meet the following day at a nearby clinic to have the test done. As Juliet watched Sebastian leave the bakery, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The next morning, they met outside the clinic. Juliet was nervous, her hands fidgeting with her bracelet as they walked inside. Sebastian offered her a reassuring smile. "It'll be all right," he said. "Whatever the results, we'll figure it out together." The test itself was quick and painless, a simple swab of the cheek for each of them. The technician assured them that the results would be ready within a week. As they left the clinic, Juliet felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for doing this," Sebastian said as they walked to his car. Juliet gave him a small smile. "I'm curious, too. I've always wondered about my family, but I never thought I'd get any answers." Sebastian hesitated before speaking. "No matter what the results say, you've already given me something I didn't think I'd have, hope." They parted ways, each lost in their own thoughts. Over the next few days, Juliet tried to focus on her work at the bakery, but her mind kept drifting to the possibility that she might have a family out there, a real family, not just a distant concept she had dreamed of as a child. Sebastian, meanwhile, found himself growing more impatient as the days passed. He tried to distract himself with work at the gallery, but nothing could shake the anticipation. The photograph of Celeste and the baby became a constant presence on his desk, a reminder of the answers that were just within reach. When the results finally came in, Sebastian called Juliet immediately. "It's true," he said, his voice trembling. "You're my niece." Juliet was silent for a moment, her breath catching. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Sebastian replied. "But if you're ready, I'd like to take you to meet the rest of the family." Though apprehensive, Juliet agreed. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. The drive to the family estate was long and winding, the road cutting through rolling hills and dense woods. Juliet stared out the window, her mind racing as the car approached the Hall estate. Sebastian had been quiet for most of the trip, sensing her nerves and choosing to let her process things in her own time. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Juliet turned to him, offering a small, uncertain smile. "I think so. It's just overwhelming. I've spent my whole life wondering where I came from, and now I'm about to meet people who might have all the answers. Sebastian nodded, his expression sympathetic. I understand. But no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. His words brought a measure of comfort, and Juliet felt her shoulders relax slightly. As they rounded a bend in the road, the Hall estate came into view. The mansion was enormous, its white columns gleaming in the sunlight. Manicured gardens surrounded the property, with fountains and hedges arranged in intricate patterns. Juliet's breath caught at the sight. It was a world away from the small, cozy bakery she had always known. Wow, she murmured. Sebastian smiled faintly. It's impressive, isn't it? But don't let the grandeur fool you. This house has its fair share of shadows. They pulled up to the front entrance, where a butler was waiting to greet them. He opened the car door for Juliet, offering her a polite nod. Welcome to the Hall estate, he said. Juliet stepped out, her gaze sweeping over the towering mansion. She felt small and out of place, her simple dress and scuffed boots a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Sebastian led her inside, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as if to steady her. The foyer was even grander than the exterior, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and an elegant staircase that curved up to the second floor. Sebastian. A commanding voice echoed through the space, and Juliet turned to see a woman descending the staircase. Eleanor Hall moved with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding attention. Her silver hair was impeccably styled, and her tailored dress exuded wealth and authority. Mother, Sebastian greeted, his tone measured. Eleanor's sharp gaze landed on Juliet, her brow furrowing. And who is this? Sebastian stepped forward, his voice steady. Mother, this is Juliet. She's Celeste's daughter. For a moment, Eleanor's expression froze, her usual composure slipping. Then her brow knitted in confusion. What kind of nonsense is this? It's not nonsense, Sebastian replied. We did a DNA test. The results are conclusive. Juliet is family. Eleanor's eyes flicked between them, her disbelief evident. You expect me to believe that after all these years, Celeste had a child and we knew nothing about it? I didn't believe it at first either, Sebastian admitted. But it's true. You can see the resemblance, can't you? Eleanor's gaze lingered on Juliet, and for a moment, her steely demeanor softened. There was something familiar about the girl, her wide eyes, the curve of her smile. Where have you been all this time? Eleanor asked, her voice quieter now. Juliet hesitated, unsure of how much to say. I was abandoned as a baby, she said finally. I grew up in a small town, raised by kind people. But I never knew anything about my family until now. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Why didn't Celeste tell us? She murmured, almost to herself. Certainly because she knew you wouldn't approve, Sebastian said, his tone laced with bitterness. Eleanor shot him a sharp look, but before she could respond, a thought seemed to strike her. Summon Jason, she said to the butler. He needs to hear this. Sebastian stiffened at the mention of his brother, but he didn't object. Juliet watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing an undercurrent of tension between them. The butler disappeared, and Eleanor turned back to Juliet. I want to hear everything, she said, her tone softening. Tell me about your life. How did you end up here? Juliet hesitated, then began to speak. She told Eleanor the little she knew about her origins, how she had been found on the steps of a church, the bracelet and a blanket her only belongings. She spoke of her life in the small town, her work at the bakery, and the quiet contentment she had found there. As she spoke, Eleanor listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to something resembling grief. You've had a difficult life, Eleanor said finally. And yet, you've turned out remarkably well. Juliet blushed at the unexpected compliment. Thank you, she said softly. Eleanor's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before she straightened, her composure returning. Jason will want to meet you, she said. This is as much his concern as mine. Juliet wasn't sure what to expect from Jason, but the prospect of meeting another family member filled her with both anticipation and dread. She glanced at Sebastian, who gave her a reassuring nod. Don't worry, he said quietly. You'll be fine. The sound of footsteps echoed through the foyer as Jason entered. He was tall and imposing, his suit impeccably tailored. His sharp features and cool demeanor gave him an air of authority that was hard to ignore. Mother, he greeted Eleanor with a nod before his gaze shifted to Juliet. His expression hardened immediately, his eyes narrowing. What is this? Jason demanded, his tone sharp. Jason, Eleanor said, her voice steady. We have a surprise for you. This is Juliet. She's Celeste's daughter. Jason's reaction was immediate and startling. What are you doing here? He snapped, his voice filled with anger. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. Jason, Eleanor finally said, her tone firm. If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, I expect you to behave like the gentleman I raised you to be. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak. The room was silent for a long moment, the clinking of silverware in the dining room next door, and the soft rustle of table linens as dinner was getting ready to be served the only sounds. Jason's eyes flashed with something unreadable, anger, perhaps, or fear. He stood up abruptly. I need some air, he muttered, striding toward the door without another word. Eleanor started to rise, but Sebastian motioned for her to stay. I'll handle this, he said, standing and following Jason out of the room. Juliet watched them go, her chest tight with unease. She turned to Eleanor, who was now staring at her wine glass, her expression pensive. Is it always like this? Juliet asked softly. Eleanor let out a small, bitter laugh. Welcome to the Hall family. Outside, Sebastian found Jason pacing near the fountain in the garden. The moonlight cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his features. What is wrong with you? Sebastian demanded, his voice low but heated. Jason stopped, his hands clenched into fists. You don't understand, Sebastian. This isn't as simple as you think. Then explain it to me, Sebastian shot back. Because all I see is you trying to drive Juliet away for no good reason. Jason's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. Damn it, Jason, Sebastian said, his voice rising. What are you hiding? Jason turned away, his shoulders stiff. You wouldn't understand. Sebastian stepped closer, his anger radiating off him. Try me. Jason's hands tightened at his sides, and for a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. But then, with a heavy sigh, he said, Fine. You want the truth? I'll tell you everything. Jason stood by the fountain, his posture rigid as he stared at the rippling water. The faint sound of crickets filled the cool evening air, but the stillness was suffocating. Sebastian stood nearby, his arms crossed, waiting for Jason to speak. The tension between the brothers was palpable, years of unresolved resentment bubbling to the surface. Finally, Jason exhaled sharply and turned to face Sebastian. You want the truth, he said, his voice low and strained. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and frustration. I've waited years for answers, Jason. Just say it. Jason's jaw clenched as he gathered his thoughts. Celeste came to me before she disappeared, he began. She was terrified, scared out of her mind. She'd just found out she was pregnant. Sebastian's breath caught, but he said nothing, allowing Jason to continue. She didn't want to face Mother, Jason said, his tone bitter. You know how she was, how she still is. Celeste was convinced that if Mother found out about the pregnancy, she'd never forgive her. So, she begged me for help. She wanted to leave, to figure things out on her own. Sebastian's hands tightened into fists. And you just let her go? Jason shook his head. I didn't just let her go, Sebastian. I arranged for her to stay in a cottage far from the city. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she had the baby. The plan was for her to give the child up for adoption and then come back once everything had blown over. Sebastian took a step closer, his anger simmering. You knew where she was, and you didn't tell anyone? Not me, not Mother. Jason's voice rose defensively. She didn't want anyone to know. She made me promise to keep it a secret. I was trying to protect her. Protect her? Sebastian said incredulously. You isolated her. You let her face everything alone. Jason's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, his facade cracked. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't know she'd get sick. Sebastian froze. What are you talking about? Jason's gaze dropped to the ground. There were complications. Something went wrong during the pregnancy. By the time I found out how bad it was too late. She died during childbirth. The words hit Sebastian like a punch to the gut. He staggered back a step, his mind racing to process the revelation. She died? Jason nodded, his expression hollow. She made me promise to take care of the baby. To make sure it was adopted by a good family, far away from all of this. We even created a sauterie about her being abandoned at a church so she wouldn't ask questions. He gestured vaguely toward the mansion. She didn't want her child growing up in this world. Sebastian's anger flared again, sharp and unrelenting. So, you just gave the baby away? You didn't think we had a right to know? You didn't think Mother deserved to know what happened to her own daughter? Jason's voice rose to match Sebastian's. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to carry this secret all these years? I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it was what Celeste would have wanted. Don't you dare use her as an excuse, Sebastian snapped. You made this decision for yourself. You were protecting your own damn position in this family. Jason's face twisted with guilt and anger. You think I don't regret it? You think I don't wake up every day wishing I'd done things differently? I've lived with this for 20 years, Sebastian. Every time I look at Mother, I see what I've taken from her. The brothers stood in silence, the weight of Jason's confession hanging heavy between them. Inside the mansion, Eleanor and Juliet waited anxiously in the drawing room. Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Juliet paced near the fireplace, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to ask. Finally, Juliet broke the silence. What do you think they're talking about? Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the floor. I don't know, she admitted, her voice uncharacteristically soft. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew their attention. A moment later, Sebastian entered the room, his face pale and drawn. Jason followed, his expression grim. What's going on? Eleanor demanded, rising to her feet. Sebastian glanced at Juliet, then at Eleanor. Jason has something to tell you. Jason shot his brother a glare but didn't argue. He stepped forward, his shoulders squared as he faced his mother. It's about Celeste, he said quietly. And Juliet. Eleanor's breath caught, her hand flying to her chest. What about them? Jason hesitated, his gaze flickering to Juliet before returning to Eleanor. Celeste didn't just disappear. She came to me. She was pregnant, and she was afraid. I helped her leave, but she didn't survive. She died during childbirth. Eleanor staggered back, her hand clutching the arm of the sofa for support. She's gone. Jason nodded, his voice heavy with regret. I'm sorry, Mother. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I failed her. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she sank into the sofa, her composure shattering. Juliet stood frozen, her mind reeling. Jason turned to Juliet, his expression earnest. Your mother loved you. She wanted you to have a better life than what she thought this family could offer. That's why she asked me to find a home for you. The room fell into a heavy silence, the truth settling over them like a storm. The confession had left the Hall family in disarray. Eleanor remained seated on the sofa, her usually composed demeanor shattered as she stared at the floor. Juliet stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her emotions roiling beneath the surface. Jason lingered by the doorway, his back to the others, as if trying to shield himself from their judgment. Sebastian paced the room, his frustration bubbling over. You had no right, he said, his voice shaking with anger. You had no right to make that decision for Celeste or for Juliet. Jason turned slowly, his expression hollow. I know that now, he said. But at the time, I thought I was protecting her. I thought I was protecting all of us. Eleanor looked up sharply, her voice cold and cutting. You didn't protect anyone, Jason. You destroyed us. You took my daughter from me, and you took Juliet's mother from her. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jason's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt bearing down on him. I've lived with that knowledge every single day, he said quietly. I've been haunted by it. That's not enough, Sebastian snapped. Your guilt doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring Celeste back, and it doesn't erase the pain you've caused. Juliet stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. I spent my whole life wondering why I was abandoned. Wondering why no one wanted me. And now, to find out that it wasn't my mother's choice, that it was yours, it's almost too much to handle. Jason turned to her, his expression pleading. I didn't mean to hurt you, Juliet. I thought I was giving you a chance at a better life. You didn't give me a chance, Juliet said, her voice rising. You took away my choice. You took away my mother's choice. How could you think that was right? Jason had no answer. He lowered his head, his silence speaking volumes. Eleanor rose from the sofa, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached Jason, her icy gaze fixed on him. You were my son, she said quietly. I trusted you. I trusted that you would do what was best for this family. But you betrayed us. Jason flinched, the words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. I didn't mean to betray anyone, he said. I thought I was doing what Celeste wanted. What Celeste wanted? Eleanor repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. Celeste wanted her family to support her. She wanted love, not judgment. And instead, she got you, a brother who abandoned her when she needed him most. Sebastian stepped forward, his expression hard. You've spent your whole life hiding behind this family's name, Jason. Using it as a shield for your mistakes. But this time, you don't get to hide. You need to own up to what you've done. Jason looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each of them. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice breaking. Tell me how I can fix this. You can't fix it, Juliet said firmly. But you can stop running from it. You can tell the truth, to all of us, and take responsibility for the choices you made. Jason nodded slowly, the fight draining out of him. All right, he said. You're right. It's time. Eleanor turned away, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. I need a moment, she said, her voice muffled. I can't deal with this right now. She left the room quickly, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Juliet watched her go, her heart aching for the woman who had lost so much. Sebastian moved closer to Juliet, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than I ever imagined, he said quietly. Juliet managed a weak smile, though her eyes were filled with unshed tears. I don't feel strong, she admitted. I feel like everything I thought I knew is falling apart. It is, Sebastian said gently. But sometimes, that's the only way to rebuild. Jason nodded, though he didn't lift his head. I'll tell her everything, he said. I'll tell Mother the whole truth about Celeste, about everything. Sebastian exchanged a glance with Juliet, his expression softening. It's a start, he said. The hours that followed were heavy with emotion. Eleanor eventually returned, her composure regained, though her eyes were red-rimmed. Jason sat with her in the study, recounting every detail of what had happened all those years ago. His voice was steady, but his pain was evident. Eleanor listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Jason finished, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. You've done irreparable damage, she said. But at least now, we know the truth. Jason nodded, his head bowed. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, he said. You can't make it right, Eleanor replied. But you can start by stepping back. You've led this family for years, Jason, but it's clear now that your judgment is flawed. It's time for a change. Jason looked up sharply, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. Sebastian watched the exchange, his feelings a mix of satisfaction and sadness. The family was finally confronting its demons, but the process was far from over. As the evening wore on, Juliet found herself alone in the garden. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the tension inside. She stared up at the stars, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Sebastian joined her, his presence comforting. You did well today, he said. Juliet smiled faintly. It doesn't feel like it. Everything still feels so broken. Maybe, Sebastian said. But broken things can be repaired. It just takes time. Juliet nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was starting to find her place. The Hall estate felt quieter than usual the next morning, as if the weight of Jason's confession had settled over the house, muffling its usual rhythms. Eleanor sat in the drawing room, staring out at the garden through the tall windows. Her fingers rested on the arm of her chair, her posture as regal as ever, but her face betrayed the storm of emotions she was trying to contain. Juliet entered hesitantly, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She had spent a sleepless night turning over everything she'd learned. The truth about her mother, her family, and the choices that had shaped her life still felt too big to grasp. Good morning, Juliet said quietly, stopping near the doorway. Eleanor turned her head, offering a faint smile. Good morning, dear. Come, sit with me. Juliet moved to the sofa across from Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I owe you an apology, Eleanor said finally, her voice steady but tinged with regret. Juliet blinked in surprise. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Eleanor interrupted gently. I failed your mother. I created an environment where she felt she couldn't come to me, where she felt she had to hide. And because of that, I lost her. And you. Juliet's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this kind of vulnerability from Eleanor, who had seemed so composed and unshakable when they first met. I don't blame you, Juliet said softly. You didn't know. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands. That's no excuse. I was so consumed with my own expectations, my own vision of what this family should be, that I pushed her away. And now, all I can do is try to make amends. Juliet reached out hesitantly, placing her hand over Eleanor's. You're trying now, she said. That's what matters. Eleanor looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're remarkably forgiving, she said with a small, sad smile. Juliet shrugged. I've spent my whole life wondering about my family. Now that I have the chance to know you, I don't want to waste it. Eleanor squeezed her hand, her expression softening. You're more like your mother than you realize." They sat together in companionable silence, the tension between them beginning to ease. Elsewhere in the house, Sebastian found Jason in the library, seated in one of the leather armchairs with a glass of scotch in hand. Jason looked up as his brother entered, his expression guarded. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Jason said, his tone neutral. Sebastian crossed the room and took the chair opposite him. "Not until I know what you're going to do next." Jason let out a dry laugh, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Is that your way of saying you don't trust me?" "Should I?" Sebastian countered. Jason sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've made mistakes. I won't deny that. But I meant what I said last night. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." "And what does that look like to you?" Sebastian asked, his voice sharp. Jason's gaze turned inward, his jaw tightening. "It means stepping back. From the business, from the estate. Letting someone else take the reins. I've spent too long trying to control everything, and look where it's gotten us." Sebastian studied him for a long moment, searching for signs of insincerity, but he found none. "If you're serious about this, then I'll support you. But if I see even a hint of manipulation, I won't hesitate to call you out." Jason met his brother's gaze, a faint flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Fair enough." The conversation ended there, the two brothers falling into an uneasy truce. By midday, the family gathered in the garden for lunch. The tension of the previous night still lingered, but there was a tentative effort to move forward. Eleanor took her usual place at the head of the table, her gaze softening as she watched Juliet interact with Sebastian. "You've done well with her," Eleanor said quietly to Jason, who sat beside her. Jason glanced at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I deserve that." Eleanor sighed, her tone firm but not unkind. "You made terrible choices, Jason. But you're here now. And that's a start." As the meal continued, Juliet began to feel a small sense of ease. The conversation was light, the laughter genuine, and for the first time, she felt like she might truly belong. Later, Juliet wandered through the garden alone, her thoughts drifting. The vibrant flowers and neatly trimmed hedges provided a sense of calm, a welcome respite from the whirlwind of emotions she had been navigating. She paused by a small fountain, watching the water cascade over the stone. The bracelet on her wrist caught the sunlight, the tiny star charm glinting like a beacon. "You seem lost in thought," Sebastian's voice said from behind her. Juliet turned to see him approaching, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I was just thinking about my mom," she said. "And how much I wish I could have known her." Sebastian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She would have loved you," he said. "I know she would have." Juliet smiled faintly, her gaze returning to the fountain. "I like to think so. But I can't help wondering, what would she think of all of this? Of how things turned out?" Sebastian placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "I think she'd be proud of you. And I think she'd want you to know that it's okay to let people in. To trust that you belong here." Juliet looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Sebastian. For everything." "Don't thank me," he said with a grin. "I'm just the messenger." They shared a quiet laugh, the tension lifting slightly. As the sun began to set, casting the garden in hues of gold and pink, Juliet felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey had been painful, but it had also brought her closer to the answers she had always sought. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, with her family by her side.